Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog.
Tonight we are very, very honored to introduce Dr. Mahadevan. He is the Valpine Professor of Applied Mathematics. He's also Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and also Professor of Physics, all at Harvard University. After graduating from the Indian Institute of Technology, he moved to the United States, where he received 2 master's degrees and then took his PhD at Stanford University in 1995. Thereafter, he taught at Oxford and at Cambridge universities, and then at MIT, where he became a tenured professor in mechanical engineering, and then he was lured to Harvard with all his titles there. Dr. Mahadevan's list of awards and distinctions are very extensive. I'll just mention a few. You can see more on his website. There's a link to that on our website for tonight's event page. He received a 2009 MacArthur Genius Grant. He's received the Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship and Harvard's George Ledley Prize. He has presented many times at prestigious invited lectures, and he has served on numerous editorial and advisory boards. I should say he continues to do this and is probably one of the busiest people on the planet. A distinguishing feature of Dr. Mahadevan's genius is his ability to discover and explain complex relationships between form and function in nature, especially the underlying geometry of structures and processes at the very smallest to the very largest scales. Most of what we see superficially. Dr. Mahadevan reveals the underlying secrets of how things fold, how they flow, how they drape, how they grow, and many other everyday processes that evade our senses. Tonight, he explains how origami, a type of folding generally associated with art, is present in many natural structures, and it has numerous applications. You will, I think, be surprised at how beautiful nature really is when he finishes talking tonight, how the understanding of the relationship between form and function makes us appreciate a much deeper level of nature. And please welcome Dr. Mahadevan.
Nice and generous introduction. So from now it's downhill. Okay, so what I'd like to do over the next hour or so is try and give you a flavor of the world of origami as I see it. I'm going to talk naturally about some of the work that I've been involved in, but I'd also like to essentially give you a sense of what other people around are doing. The title that I gave Yvonne Stapp was Origami Art, Science, and Technology, and I'm going to sort of take you for a walk through this garden over the next some time. You all know of origami primarily through art, and this is one of a set of very beautiful origami folded sculptures, if you will, thanks to this fantastic Japanese artist Kamiya, which you can actually find on the website. So if you think about it from the point of view of art, it's quite remarkable that you can take a piece of paper which starts out being featureless and end up over there. If you think about it from a point of view of science, and I'm going to spend some time on it, you can actually see it in very different places. You see it over here in the context of a leaf. You see it over here in the context of just a drying piece of jello. And this, of course, takes a lot more effort to make than this. This is a piece of paper which has been folded into a very simple kind of origami, which is named for the inventor, Koryo Miura, who invented this a long time ago. And this is essentially a mathematical model which has been rendered on a computer. So you have it in art. I'm going to show you that you actually see origami appearing very naturally in a number of scientific settings. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about work that I haven't directly been involved in, but has become one of the primary motive forces for essentially how origami is being thought of today, which is in the context of technology. And so this is a video actually due to an artist, but inspired by science. So what you see over here is happening in real time. So there's a little piece of metal or plastic foil which has hinges, and you put it on water, and these hinges essentially swell in the presence of water, and this thing starts to open up, and you can see 3 or 4 generations of it opening up. So there is clearly an artistic sense that appeals to it as soon as you see it, but there is also a scientific question associated with how one might engineer, how one might control, and how one might make functional some of these patterns. Okay? So sort of, as I said, I'll take you for a little walk through some of these examples over the next 45 minutes or so. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about the history of this beautiful art, because in fact the artists kept it alive for a very long time, and a theme that I hope you will see right through is that science and technology are usually the last in the room. Artists and artisans essentially have been thinking about these problems for a very long time, and it's only very recently in the last 40 or 50 years that people started thinking about it scientifically. In fact, in the context of technology, it's not even the last 10 years, I would say. Okay, so origami as art essentially started pretty much with the invention of paper, which we think happened in China almost 2,000 years ago. And in Chinese, origami, or the art of paper folding, is called zheqi. Okay? It came to Japan a few centuries later, people think, about 400 or 600 years later. And in both China and Japan, origami was associated with a number of different kinds of ceremonial occasions. So you built these paper models, you gave them as offerings, you set them afloat on water. And one of the more famous origami pieces of folding sculpture are associated with butterflies, which were typically associated with these ceremonial occasions. In Japanese, the word origami comes from the origin etymologically from oru, which means fold, and kami, which means paper. So Miura ori, which I described to you a couple of minutes ago, which I'll come back to, is called Miura ori because ori is fold, and the fold is due to Dr. Koryo Miura. Okay, so if I think about characterizing origami from the perspective of instructions for a child, or the child in all of us anyway, you would basically take a featureless piece of paper and you try to characterize the folds, and the colors over here distinguish whether I have mountain folds or valley folds. And you need to essentially put these folds in place at the right time. So you need a particular sequence, otherwise you'll get frustrated. And in fact, if you're able to do this, and I think children do this far better than adults, then you can get shapes like the crane or the butterfly. And this is an example of a photograph of a very large number of cranes, inspired by this very sad and moving story of Japanese child who was essentially a survivor of one of the atomic bomb explosions in 1945, Sadako Sasai, and she essentially wished for 1,000 cranes to be built, and she survived about 10 years beyond the war. And there's a wonderful book which I encourage you to read. Okay, so that's a little bit of the cultural history of origami compressed into 3 or 4 minutes. And as I said, this whole art form had persisted, had been sustained by artists, but really took off in Japan over the last 100 years or so, thanks to this person over here, Akira Yoshizawa, who passed away just a few years ago. And he essentially used his abilities to fold to create a very large number of patterns, which he then put down in a large number of books, and also introduced some new techniques. The origami that most of you are probably familiar with is associated with what is called dry folding. You take a piece of paper and then you fold it, and that's it. Akira Yoshizawa essentially introduced the notion of wet folding. So you essentially moisten the paper, and when you moisten the paper, then it becomes easier to fold, and the folds also are not so strong, so they are much more rounded. Okay, so for example, you see this bull, and you can see there are a lot more rounded surfaces rather than in a crane, which you might make of, which has very sharp corners and sharp creases. And I'll come back to this in a minute in a few minutes in the context of how we understand this from the point of view of physics. Okay, so that's the history, very much compressed, but it's very important because essentially it was sustained by artists and artisans, this form. If I think about it from the point of view of science, if I think about it from the point of view of mathematics, and I ask, what is it that makes origami possible? What are the elements of origami? In fact, the first and the most important thing is that you have to start with an object which is like a sheet of paper, has lateral dimensions which are large and one dimension which is extremely small. That's critical. So even though it's typically done with paper as an art form, in fact, it can be done with anything. It can be done with a thin sheet of aluminum. It can be done with a thin sheet of steel if you have enough ability to apply forces. So it's approximately two-dimensional. I say approximately two-dimensional because even though mathematically you might be able to idealize it as a surface, in fact its thickness is present. It's very small, but it's present, and that's important because that essentially is responsible for the second aspect associated with the elements of origami, which I can break up into a few different parts because it makes it easy to follow. So a sheet of paper or a piece of fabric such as the one that you wear is relatively easy to bend out of the plane, but it's essentially impossible to stretch. You can apply a large force on it, but it doesn't essentially change its length, and it's very hard to essentially try and change angles in it, so you can't also shear it. So that's an important part of our ability to essentially make what I'm going to tell you in a minute is the critical basic structure, are the basic structures of origami. And this property that it's hard to stretch or hard to shear is essentially independent of the material. It simply depends on it being approximately two-dimensional. You can take a piece of metal, you can take a piece of paper, you can take a piece of plastic, and they all have this fundamental characteristic that it's very hard to essentially change the elements of length or angles in the piece, but it's very easy to essentially bend it out of the plane. As I said, it's very easy to bend. If I bend it smoothly and I let it go, it just comes right back, so it has no memory. But if I bend it very strongly, then I can essentially get creases. And we need these creases because without these creases, we're not going to get shapes which persist. And a critical part of origami is, of course, that once I essentially bend it substantially, I form these sharp creases, and those creases have a memory. Okay? That crease, an individual crease having a memory, is essentially the beginning of the origins of shape, because I'm not going to be able to make shape with a thin sheet of paper unless after I did something to it, it remembered what I did. It doesn't have to have a perfect memory, but it has to have some. So this is essentially the fundamental reason why we need a thin sheet in the context of having the elements of origami. And there's one bit of terminology, which if you open in any origami book, you will find very early on, which is what are the fundamental units of origami. And the fundamental units of origami are basically mountains and valleys. And in fact, you can really think of them as the same, because every mountain becomes a valley, and every valley becomes a mountain when you flip it around. And if you look at the structure, I'm sorry that this picture is faded a little bit. If you look at the structure of a pattern for folding, what you will see primarily, first thing is the lines along which you fold. Red could correspond, for example, to mountains, and blue corresponds to valleys. And then in addition, somebody has to also tell you the order. That's of course not there, but those are the two things that you will see when you open up a book. And with those two, in principle, you should be able to build complex origamis. And I, again, want to tell you a little bit about the etymology because it's kind of fun. The word complex in the English language comes from the Latin root com, which means together, and plicare, which means fold. So it's interesting because we use the word complex all the time, but it has a very natural sense in which it directly relates to origami. Just like origami is, as I said, folding paper, complex is essentially to fold together. Okay? So complex origami is taking these individual folds and putting them together So it is important that it's been done sequentially, and therefore the order in space and the order in time matters. Otherwise, you get frustrated physically and intellectually. Okay, you do this like a person, an origami giant like Kamiya does, and then if I'm thinking about straight folds, you can create these beautiful monsters like these wonderful dragons. Okay? And then you can ask the following question. I've shown you now a few examples, and perhaps all the examples that you might have been familiar with in the context of origami are associated with straight folds. So now there's a natural question that you can ask, which is, can you have curved folds? All right? I see some people nodding. And actually, I'll ask the question, and I'm going to first show you an answer. In fact, the curved folds are very common. You just haven't perhaps paid attention to them. Okay? The first and very common curved fold is every collar that you've ever seen. Because if you take off the collar, you straighten it, you will see that you're essentially folding along a crease. And when you fold along a crease, the inside drapes your neck, and the outside is essentially forming a kind of a wing. That's example number one. Very, very common curved fold. Example number two, these are very pedestrian examples. This one I like particularly. If you've ever been to essentially McDonald's and bought a box of fries, you see that the box starts out flat, but then just before the person puts the fries inside, he or she opens up the box, and when they open up the box, I'm sorry, I don't have the flattened version of it, you can see now that the bottom is curved in one direction and the sides are curved in the opposite direction, and that gives it now volume, and of course that volume allows you to put fries in it. Now, of course, curved folds don't just arise in these humdrum examples. You can actually see them in very beautiful sculpture. So this is a beautiful sculpture done by a colleague, Eric Demain, and his father, who are at MIT. And it's actually exhibited at the MoMA in New York. So this is a very beautiful example of how you can take a piece of paper and fold it with a lot of effort along curves, and out comes something really beautiful. But it also has these extraordinarily wonderful everyday origins. So, okay, so why is origami possible, or what makes origami possible is the fact that essentially it's made of a thin sheet of something, and that thin sheet of something suffices in order to basically have memory when I crease it sufficiently, and it's hard to stretch and hard to bend. So I want to now make that a little bit mathematical and quantitative. I apologize for that, but I simply want to say that every piece of origami that you essentially have, forget these equations, every piece of origami that you have can be thought of as constructed of little pieces of flat paper linked up to cones, and those cones are linked up to cylinders. So you just basically think of any piece of origami and it will have these three elements. So just like if you go to a tailor or a fancy couturier, and they'll tell you that you have to basically have these kinds of cuts and those kinds of stitches in order to essentially drape the body. Every piece of origami has as its elements pieces of cones, pieces of cylinders, and pieces of flats put together. So the ingredients are very simple, but the way they come together is quite remarkable. All right, so I want to now tell you about a wonderful little aspect of origami which is very easy to understand and has profound consequences. I want to tell you about a little theorem in origami. And I want to essentially motivate it by asking, I told you about individual lines along which you can crease. But of course, these lines are not all apart from each other, because if they were all apart from each other, all I'm going to get is a set of mountains and valleys. These lines then meet, and when they meet now, a question that you can ask is, what happens at the locations where these creases meet? And in particular, you can ask, are there any interesting criteria associated with taking a piece of paper which started out flat, and then I folded it. In this case, I just folded it in a very simple form. It's also flat. Okay? So are there any criteria which distinguish when and if you can do this? I'll give you an example over here with this piece of paper. I have another example which I'll come back to in a minute, which is this bag. It starts out flat. I open it initially this way, and then I open it this way, and then eventually it is capable of storing whatever you needed to store in it. And these folds allow you to essentially go from one set of flat conditions to another set of flat conditions. And the question you can ask is there anything special about that? The crane started out flat, featureless, you folded it, and it had the shape of now a bird, but it was also flat. So what happens when creases meet is a natural question that you can ask. In an architectural setting, if I wanted to cover a roof, I want to know, is it possible to essentially open it so that it becomes flat? And then is it possible to close or do something else which also perhaps might keep it flat? Okay, so in the crane, for example, this is the formed crane, this is the set of folds which essentially gives you the crane. And one can ask, is there something specific about flat foldability? Okay, so this is now two little results which I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you by basically demonstrating. The equations are there just so that you know that one can make this quantitative, but the intuition, the concept is very simple. So I have here, so this was a flat sheet of paper initially, I folded it, and when I folded it, I got 1, 2, 3 mountain folds and 1 valley fold. And of course, it's exactly the same if I flip it around, where I have now 1 mountain and 3 valleys. And these 3 mountains and 1 valley, or vice versa, met at a point. And you know, if I now open it up, and I look at the angle that each crease made with its neighboring crease, if I add up all the angles, I must have all the angles add up to the angles associated with moving around a circle, which means 180 degrees, 360 degrees, excuse me, right? So if I add up all the angles, they must add up to 360 degrees. So that's a simple little theorem. But there is another much more non-trivial theorem, and that says the following. That says that the part of this fold which is visible over here can be obtained by going forward along the back and then backward, or it's the difference between this angle, the angle at the back, and what is visible over here, but it's also the difference between that angle and this one. Does everybody see that? Okay, so what is visible is essentially the difference of 2 angles on one side or also 2 angles on the opposite side. Or equivalently, I can, when I go back and forth, so I go along one fold, then I come back along the second fold, then I go along the third one, and then I come back. At the end, I've essentially gone around the whole. Okay? And when I write that out, what happens is that I get that the alternate angles must add up, and the alternate angles must add up to 180 degrees. So this is an important condition, because these two conditions essentially define for me when I can take a sheet of paper, fold it up, and then end up with a folded structure which you might appreciate. But now I've essentially quantified this mathematically. Or when I say I've quantified this, we've known about this for a few tens of years. Okay? And so then one can ask the following question. If I start with a sheet of paper which is flat, and I end up with a complicated origami sculpture which is also flat, can you fold this structure, for example, the crane, from a flat sheet, moving through a sequence of moves so that you end up with the crane and never have to stretch the paper anywhere? Because this condition that I gave you is a condition which is true at every one of the vertices. So it's true at that vertex, at that vertex, at that vertex, and so on. But it doesn't say how they all talk to each other, which is exactly what you need to understand if I wanted to figure out how to take this flat sheet of paper and convert it to something like an origami fold. Mathematically, that's saying that if I satisfy this condition at every vertex, that's local flat foldability, does it imply global flat foldability? Which means that can I go from here to here without ever stretching the paper? Okay. So this was for a long time open, and why is this interesting from the point of view of science or even application? It's interesting because if I want to construct complicated shapes, I need to know how to start from a flat sheet and end up with this complex shape. And if I can't do that, there are some obstructions, and so this is important to know. In fact, for the paper bag, it turns out that you can't go from something which is open to something which is closed without actually stretching it. So this is not possible. The answer is no, you can't do that. And what that means is that the mathematics is very powerful in telling you what you can't do, but if you want to go ahead and try to do that, you have to worry about the fact that the sheet of paper is actually made of a real material, and real materials cannot really ever be infinitely rigid, and therefore they will stretch a little or shear a little. So I have to now account for this level of realism in accounting for the fact that the thin sheet is not rigid, perfectly rigid. And I'll show you what the consequences of that are in a few minutes. Okay, so I told you about the elements of origami. I told you about a little bit of mathematics associated with what makes rigid origami possible. I now want to tell you that, in fact, origami doesn't appear just in an artist's hands, but in fact it appears very naturally even in nature. And I want to first tell you about one of the most popular well-studied origami examples is this mountain valley fold. This set of mountain valley folds where I have, as I said, 1, 2, 3 mountains and 1 valley. And now, in your mind's eye, I'd like you to imagine, take that and just repeat it in this direction, and repeat it in that direction, repeat it in that direction an infinite number of times. So I have a sequence of mountain valley folds, all of which look exactly the same. That's what you'll see. Okay? So I have a model of that over here. In fact, I think the picture is exactly of this model. So here it is. So this is essentially now, took a little while for me to essentially build this a long time ago. This was invented by, as I mentioned before, by an astrophysicist and an engineer, Koryo Miura. And he essentially built this because he had a very clever idea of using this structure as a way to pack solar sails so that you can essentially take it up into space and then deploy it very easily because you get a large surface area. In fact, he also built a version of this which you can buy in Tokyo as a subway map. Okay? I'm going to show you how you can essentially deploy this. You can open the entire map in one move, and you can also close the entire map in one move. And I want to point out why this is interesting, and also I should emphasize why it ought to surprise you, because most of you probably now don't use maps when you drive cars, since you have phones and GPS devices and so on and so forth. But those of you who remember when you used to use maps, at least the way humans fold them, are, I think, wonderful, what's the word, representative of how foolish we can be. Because maps are folded always in orthogonal directions. You fold it in one, and then you fold it or open it in a perpendicular direction. So that when you open it, it's relatively easy about how to proceed, because you're always opening it so that you increase the area. But when you close it, every fold has 2 possibilities. And if I have n folds, I have 2 to the n possibilities, and so you get thoroughly confused. But what I showed you is that our infinite stupidity was associated with the fact that if only we had thought of not having the folds perpendicular to each other, if the folds were at a slight angle to each other, then they will all open simultaneously and then they will all close simultaneously. And it took man a few thousand years to realize, after the invention of paper, that what you should have done was to follow Koryo Miura, because now the whole thing opens and closes in one move. So mathematically, that means that you have just 1 degree of freedom rather than having 2 to the power n. Okay, so this is a beautiful structure. It is even, as I said, starting to become used in many different engineering applications. But in fact, it turns out that it also can be seen spontaneously. I showed you an image of this. So here is a piece of gelatin which is drying. Actually, it's dried. So it's gelatin. You just put it on your petri dish or on top of your table. You walk away and come back after a couple of days. And where will it dry first? It dries on the surface first. And so the surface forms a little skin, and then the inside starts to essentially dry. And as the inside dries, it also shrinks. So it puts the surface film into compression. And when it puts the surface film into compression, you can essentially see exactly this pattern forming. But it's fully self-organized, or completely self-organized, in the sense that it's one of these look-ma, no hands kind of situations. Okay? Spontaneously, you get this origami pattern. And we saw this a few years ago, and we got quite excited, because this is essentially a simple way to now create at least this structure. And then I was looking around in the literature, and I found that, in fact, it's not just that you see it in these simple settings in a laboratory, but you can actually also see it in spring. When you look at leaves of not all trees, but in this case I've shown you the leaf of a hornbeam tree. You can also see this in beech leaves. And if you look at the bud, so over here you can't tell what the leaf is like inside, but you can see that as the leaf deploys, just like a solar sail, except now on a human scale, you look at the leaf and you see it has exactly the same structure as that. Just got a single midrib, and then you have these periodic folds. And what that allows essentially is that the entire leaf can deploy in one move, so to speak, because there is nobody to come and essentially unfold the leaf. Okay, so you see this in leaves. You also see this, in fact, in insect wings. And I want to share with you a video from a research group that just published this actually a few months ago, last year. So this is from the rove beetle. And you see, so you saw that the beetle has essentially shields called the elytra, under which its delicate wings are folded. And when it's ready to fly, it opens the shields, out deploy the wings, and it flies away. And soon you will see how it actually folds it back and sticks it under the shield. And it uses its abdomen in a remarkably elegant way. So it tucks it in, makes one fold, second fold, and you can almost see it's exactly this kind of fold. Okay? All right. So, in fact, origami has been around not for 40 years, even though we've thought about it for 40 years. It's been around for millions of years, probably more than 50 million years. Okay? And it has come at different places. It has appeared at different places. It has appeared in plants. It has appeared in animals. I'll show you a third place where it has appeared in animals in a minute. Why? And the answer is provided by some mathematics, which I'm not going to be able to go into, but I showed you this image. It turns out that this structure, this doubly periodic folded structure, is the natural solution that you get if I take a thin sheet and I squeeze it in two directions. And when I squeeze it in two directions, if it's attached to substrate, that's the fundamental, most stable solution that you essentially get. So this is a demonstration of exactly that. So the mathematics shows that this is generic, and in fact you see this as a consequence, not surprisingly, in very different settings, in artificial settings and in biological settings as well. Okay, so I told you about a bit of a digression mathematically. Now I want to essentially digress to tell you about some biology, and in fact tell you about how your gut and mine also have origami-like structures. So these were experiments that we did in collaboration with actually a group at Harvard in the medical school a couple of years ago. And in Cliff Tabin's group, they basically study how embryos essentially develop, various aspects of that. In particular, over here what you see is a chick embryo. This is essentially what will eventually become the brain, that will eventually become the backbone, and the organ of interest for this little part of the talk is the gut, which is a simple tube. Okay? That tube is a few millimeters in length. When the chick is about 3 days old, after the sperm and the egg have essentially come together, and about 10 days later, that gut has become rather long and all convoluted. Okay? And you can see progression as a function of time. That's not what I really want to tell you about, except to point out an important principle which allowed us to explain how this coiling occurs. And it occurred because two different tissues which were connected to each other were growing, but they were not growing at the same rate. So the gut is a tube. The tube is attached to the body by a piece of tissue. The gut grows at one rate. The tube grows at a different rate. If the tube is growing faster than the gut, then the gut is essentially going to be put into some sort of compression. And when you put it into compression, this is the pattern that you get. And to show that that is the case, if you take the gut and you cut away the tissue, then the gut straightens out. Okay? So that's basically the message that I'd like you to take away from this, because it's going to come up in a couple of minutes at different locations. And you can even build physical models of this to show that with a piece of rubber and a rubber tube, you can essentially create something which looks exactly like the biological system. So you've understood something. You can essentially make this mathematical. I won't go into that. But why am I showing you this? Because I'm showing you this as a part of how the outside looks like. And I want to emphasize the outside looks like that because this object grows relative to that. So if I'm connecting two objects, one growing more than the other, then the one that's growing faster is going to be squeezed, and the one which is growing slower is going to be pulled. So a consequence of that is some sort of compromise, and this is the compromise. What happens inside the gut? So what happens inside the gut? So if I now make a cut, this is the gut, and if I make a cut along any cross-section, then the inside is initially very smooth. After a while, you find that muscles start to develop, the muscles which essentially allow food to propagate along, and these muscles are originally oriented in a circumferential direction. So you can essentially squeeze this way. And when that happens, the inside of the gut, which is originally smooth, starts to become ridge-like. Okay? So I'd like you to imagine that I have this cylinder, and it's trying to grow, but the outside prevents it from growing, and therefore you have all this excess material, and it's going to start to essentially form folds. Okay? So very similar to what I showed you what happens outside, but now inside the gut. So you form ridges. You wait a little longer, and in addition to forming muscles this way, you also form muscles that way. And when you have these muscles forming that way, these ridges, so you think of now long lines, and these ridges are squeezed in the other direction. And when they get squeezed, what do you see? You see this. Okay? You see this because initially, so I'm going to have to ask you to use your imagination. Initially, each one of these zigzags was straight and was all rolled around, and that was the gut. And then you squeezed it in one direction, or equivalently, the inside of the gut grew relative to the outside, and when that happened, these straight ridges started to become zigzag-like, and of course, you now see origami inside your gut. Okay, so this happens in the chick. It happens in humans. So here is a larger view, and you see it's exactly the same structure. And again, why does it appear? It appears because the inner layer of the gut is essentially growing faster than the outer layer, and it's growing faster in the circumferential direction, and it's also growing faster in the longitudinal direction. So it's exactly like this thin sheet on a piece of the thin surface of the piece of jello, which was being squeezed. So exactly the same thing happening both ways. Okay, and then a little later, what happens is that these zigzags form cylinders, and when they form cylinders, then they form these protrusions, which you may know of as villi. And these villi essentially allow your body or your gut to absorb nutrients, and that's important. Okay, I'll show you now a mathematical and computational model of how this is happening. So the whole gut is growing. The red layer corresponds to the inner part of the gut. And now you see exactly what I said before. You start to see these zigzags. Initially, you form these ridges like this. If I make a cut, you'll see a lot of ridges. And as it grows, and now it's starting to be constrained in the direction along, and now you essentially see. Okay, all right. Okay, so I've shown you now examples in very different biological systems where you see origami occurring, and origami occurs because you have thin sheets which are growing, and these thin sheets which are growing are constrained. They're prevented from growing in different directions, and the consequence of that constraint is that you start to fold, and that's exactly what the basic principles of origami are, except that in classical origami, the way we think about it, we do the folding, and over here it happens spontaneously. It happens on its own. Okay, all right, so I've shown you a little bit about what happens when you think about origami in these natural systems. And as I said, over the last few years, there's been a fever pitch activity from the point of view of technology. You may have heard about metamaterials. So metamaterials are materials which have properties which you might not have essentially initially thought were possible. For example, a very famous class of metamaterials in the news is associated with trying to make cloaks which are invisible. Okay, so you can basically now take science fiction ideas from Harry Potter and elsewhere and create cloaks which are invisible. People have made some progress in making invisibility cloaks, but they work only in certain wavelengths, associated with certain wavelengths of light. Similarly, you can ask whether or not you can cloak an object from the point of view of sound. So you don't have sound which propagates through. Or you can ask whether you can make properties, whether you can make materials which have very bizarre properties from the point of view of mechanical properties. For example, if I pull on an object, typically, if I pull on a piece of rubber, I don't have one with me, but if I pull on a piece of rubber, a cylinder of rubber, it'll stretch in the direction which I pulled it, and it'll get squeezed in the other direction. Okay, because it has constant volume. If I pull in one direction, then I've extended this dimension, so it must squeeze down in the other direction. Now I can ask, is it possible to construct materials where if I pull in one direction, it actually stretches in the other direction? And in fact, origami is exactly such a material. In fact, I already showed it to you. But the origami material is not, you should not think of the paper as the material, you should think of the folded piece of paper as the material. Because I pull on it, and rather than squeeze down, it's essentially opening in the direction perpendicular to where I'm pulling. Okay? So that's an unusual property because most materials don't have that, but just because of the geometry of the folds, you actually see that. In fact, you don't have to do something fancy like origami to be able to demonstrate that. You just take a piece of crumpled paper. You take a crumpled paper, the result of most of my calculations, and if I pull on it, it expands, except that this is very disordered and not very beautiful, and perhaps not even functional. Okay, so one can start to characterize these properties, and I'll simply tell you what I've said before, that this object, the Miura Ori, for example, is flat almost everywhere except for these creases. It has only 1 degree of freedom. If I pull the whole thing, it opens, and if I squeeze on it, the whole thing closes. It has this property of shrinking, sorry, this is wrong, that's a mistake. It stretches laterally when stretched axially. So a normal material would shrink laterally when I stretch it, and the object, this origami object, when I stretch it in one direction, it also stretches it. So that should be stretches rather than shrinks. Now it's also equally funny when I essentially try to bend it. I take a piece of paper, and I can take this piece of paper and I can bend it in one direction, or I can bend it in the other direction, and that's about it. I can't bend it in 2 directions simultaneously. If you try to do that, you'll end up crumpling it. In particular, can you essentially ask the question, can I take this sheet of paper and use it to drape my head or to drape my neck? And these are complex curvatures, right? The head is curved, as like at least initially close to the top. It's partly like a sphere. The neck has curvature in one direction, and at any location, the curvature in the other direction is the opposite sign. Okay, so it's like a saddle. And with piece of paper, you can't do that. But as soon as I folded the piece of paper into this origami structure, I bend in one direction, and it starts to create a saddle. So now again, you've got these interesting properties where the actual material does not have any of this. Once you put the folds in, now you can essentially do funny things. You can build a saddle, for example. Okay? So in the context of bending it, it actually can do bizarre things. Again, I'm not going to get into the details. It can essentially drape a saddle, and you can make this mathematical. All right, so that means that you can take these folded materials and create these folded objects and create metamaterials which have properties which go beyond what the basic piece of paper actually originally had, just by virtue of its geometry. And what people have been doing is essentially using this as a basis for creating machines. Right? A favorite example of mine, which was published very recently by some colleagues at Harvard, in fact, in the group of Rob Wood and colleagues, was they took many pieces of essentially a thin sheet of cardboard, and they used some actuators which essentially they used as glue to stick different parts of it, and then they heated it or actuated it otherwise, and then they had motors on it, and when they actuated the whole thing, this flat object essentially folded up and walked away. Okay? So people have started to build self-folding origami-based robots. you can not only build these things which will walk away, you can just have self-folding shapes. So anybody who's ever tried origami certainly would have folded a plane, a boat, and a crane. And so over here, again, it's one of these look-ma, no hands kinds of situation where the folds are present, and then you have little elements which can essentially shrink or swell as a function of temperature, or if you put it in a solvent, they absorb the solvent and do different things, and you just let it be. And when you let it be, if you program it appropriately so that certain folds appear first and certain folds appear second, this flat sheet of paper will fold itself into a boat. Okay? This is also recent work coming out of Harvard and MIT from different groups. And because I told you that origami is not limited to large scale, what really matters is not the absolute scale, what matters is relative scale. I need something which is thin, and I need something which is thin compared to the other two dimensions. So therefore, there's no reason to do this on only the large scale. I can go down to very small scales. And here is a pattern. I'm just going to show this to you. It's not been built into a machine over here, which has been constructed using graphene. And graphene, to remind you, is essentially a form of carbon which is 1 atom thick. And it can be very large in the other two dimensions. And so with something which is 1 atom thick, again, the thickness is small compared to the other dimensions. Over here, the other dimensions are of the order of tens of microns. You can essentially fold it. And once you can fold it, and if you can actuate it by putting molecules which will swell or shrink, you can make graphene do wonderful things. Okay. I have about 5 minutes. Yeah. So I want to finish by now basically telling you about not only using origami to understand biology, but showing you how we can use biology to maybe do other things. I told you about Akira Yoshizawa's introduction of wet origami. And in fact, a few years ago, we looked at pine cones, inspired partly by origami, but just out of curiosity. How many of you know that pine cones can essentially close? Everybody knows that they will be open because you see them outside, but a few people over here know that they can close. You just put them in water and they will close. All right? Now let me show you. So here's a pine cone. You just throw it in water, and this is a time-lapse image which essentially is associated with doing it over many hours, and it closes. And then you take it out, and it opens. And you can do this as many times as you want. Okay? The reason that this is possible is associated with the fact that at the base of every pine cone bract, that's the name for these leaf-like structures, you have little fibers which swell when they essentially are in contact with water, and then they shrink when they dry out. And that's exactly what we've been showing you over here. So knowing that, in fact, and knowing that paper is the same as wood, it's just treated wood, and so wood can swell and shrink, and you know that of your paperbacks when you leave them in the kitchen or in the bathroom for too long. There is this wonderful architect, Christian Gubran, who basically now created a printer where the printer essentially paints or prints the folds and also puts water, and as this sheet of paper comes out, it folds itself. Wow. Okay? So here is an example where knowing what that paper will swell and shrink and doing a little bit of very clever engineering, now you can essentially get these things to fold up on their own. So this is an example of now going backwards, using the math and the science to understand nature, turning that around, and then coming back and saying we can create things which are useful. Okay, so I want to finish by essentially putting all these things together. I told you about a little bit of mathematics, I told you a little bit of science, and now I want to tell you about design, which essentially takes all these things together, and I'm going to go relatively quickly. So this is something that we asked. If I have this Mura Ori, I told you that it can automatically drape a saddle, but now I wanted to ask you, can I make a hat out of it? Can I make a sleeve out of it? Can I essentially drape a body? Can I essentially become a tailor, but a mathematical tailor? And I told you also that we have some rules. Okay, so here is the basic folding pattern for that object, where one color corresponds to mountains, another one corresponds to valleys. At every vertex we have rules. I told you about these rules a while ago now. All the angles must sum up to 360 degrees, and opposite angles must sum up to 180 degrees. And so we have to respect those rules. And now we want to ask, can I take this object and create a tessellation, so some sort of tiling of the plane, and use that to program shape, because I want to ask, can I take a flat sheet of paper and make it anything? Okay? In particular, the way we wanted to do this is you give me a shape that you would like. So you give me my head, for example, and I'm going to take this, I'm going to take a few of these nodes colored in blue, and I stick them to my head. And then I have a bunch of red ones, and the red ones are above my head because it's folded, and now I allow them to move. And I ask, how do I move those red ones so that I satisfy these rules, and at the same time I also drape my head? Okay? So I want to do what I just told you. I want to place some on the surface that I want to approximate. I want others to move. I want to preserve these constraints, and I want to solve a math problem, which I can't tell you about. But when you do that, here are the kinds of structures that you can create. Okay? So this is mathematics now. Well, at least this is the result of mathematics, which I won't tell you about. You can create spirals. You can create spheres. I told you that with this sheet you can't do it, but now you can, because now I vary where the folds are. I can create saddles, I can create a pillbox, I can create a candlestick, I can create a flower vase. And a student in our group, Levi Duty, folded all of them. And so at the bottom you see, and I'm sorry you can't even see the folds, but these are real paper models of each one of those. So we designed these mathematically, and then we basically built them. Okay? What does it allow you to do? It allows you, for example, to take a flat sheet of paper, fold it, let me play that again, in one direction, and then fold it in the other direction, and I can just completely collapse it. So I can do what I said. We asked the question in general about paper bags and cranes and so on. We can't do this in general, but for some specific cases, in this case associated with cylindrical shapes by definition vary in one direction, not in the other, you can do it. So there are natural implications for architecture on the small and the large scale. You can also mathematically then design structures which have memory. This object has no memory because you can keep it anywhere in between and it's happy. The object I'm going to show you next, where I start with a flat sheet of paper, and I can now fold it up into this saddle. And as I fold it, it costs me some energy because I have to stretch my facets a little bit. And I'll play this again. You will actually see that the energy goes up and then it goes down. So it's flat foldable over here, which means all the conditions are satisfied there and there, but in between I have to stretch it. Okay? All right, and then this has implications for machines. So you have implications for architecture, you have implications for machines. You can also ask how much material does it cost to essentially take a flat sheet and fold it. And now the question is one of accuracy and effort. If I give you a lot of time, or equivalently very small facets, then I can make a very, very good approximation of a covering for my head or yours. But if I don't give you that, and you don't have the patience, then I can get a very coarse view. So there is this trade-off between accuracy and effort. And I've shown you this over here for what you would get when I had low accuracy, but I can do it very fast. And as I go up, I've shown you what happens when I increase the accuracy with smaller and smaller facets. And you can make this quantitative, you can make this mathematical, but I won't, again, get into the details of that. All right, so I'm done. So I want to basically finish. I told you about these examples which started out in art. In fact, I deliberately kept this one for the last. I think this is the first example, at least that I know of, in European traditions of origami appearing. You may have to peer a little hard to see it, but this is essentially a painting by Bronzini, and on this woman's dress, near the neck, you can actually see the muraori. So it's already there 500 years ago. You can actually buy scarves like this, and in fact, another colleague, Neri Oxman at MIT in the School of Architecture, is designing now interesting pieces of origami-inspired textiles. I told you about the mathematics and the science. There are some very, very beautiful ideas that are associated with asking questions like the following. Can I take a flat sheet of paper and convert it into the shape of a donut? You can easily convert it to a cylinder, no problem. And it can do so smoothly. But if I want to try and now take the cylinder and roll it up in the perpendicular direction, I'll try and do it for you. Okay, so here's my cylinder, and I want to try and roll it up, but you see I can't do so. It's impossible. It essentially starts to form creases. So there's a very interesting mathematical question which asks, can I give up the ability to do so smoothly, but nevertheless manage to do it? So I want to give up as little as I possibly can in terms of smoothness. So I want to have as much smoothness as possible. Can I do it? And there's a very, very interesting class of mathematical results associated with that, which goes back actually to people like John Nash from almost 50 years ago, and very recently have been realized by mathematicians shown over here, and our own little attempt. And I told you also about some examples from science and technology. I told you about art. I told you about mathematics. Now also tell you the examples of science and technology where you have origami appearing very naturally in the context of natural form and morphogenesis. I didn't have a chance to show you this, but there are engineers who essentially are now using origami architectures to build stents. Okay? So this is the folded structure. So it's essentially this object over here. And it's essentially completely contracted and compressed, and then you put it into an artery, for example, and if it's able to swell in response to the blood and the plasma and so on, it can swell, and as it swells, it'll essentially create a stent. Okay, so you go from that structure to that. So there are these very interesting classes of devices that people are building. I'll stop with my favorite example, which is the crumpled sheet of paper, okay? Because it is this tension between order and disorder which is at the root of everything that I've told you. Perfect order is a flat sheet. There's nothing in it. Complete disorder is a crumpled piece of paper. Equally, there's very little in it. It's totally random. It's this tension between order and disorder which gave rise and which gives rise and which will continue to do so about how and what we can do with origami. Thank you very much.
To learn the technique, and you showed your students the fascinating, and once you even learn it, how long does it take to make something like a vase?
That vase took 2.5 weeks. And that was after he had practiced on many of the other examples. So like in everything else, there's a very steep initial learning curve, and then you flatten out. I won't be able to do that. I did this probably 10 years ago, and so I am very fond of it, but it took me, I don't know, many hours. I don't even remember. But the question that you ask is a very, very good and a very important one, because I think there is a sense as to if I want to create something out of it in a reproducible way, how do I do it? And I've given you 2 or 3 different alternatives. I've given you an alternative which is biological, which is this. It just happens. So you use not the biology, but you use the physical and the mathematical basis for that. That's one possibility. What people typically do nowadays is play. Okay? How do you create new designs? You play. How do you essentially figure out how to fold fast? You play. Which is why I'm a mathematician, a physicist, and so one of the challenges for us is to essentially ask how easy or how hard is it to navigate through this process. And so I showed you some of our initial work, but we are still very far from trying to answer that.
When you were thinking of making the vase, did you go backwards? First you know the mathematical shape of the vase, and then go to finite element analysis or
we know
which way to fold it to get to the vase.
Yeah. No, we didn't do any finite element analysis or anything of that sort. We solved an optimization problem. So we said that we want a vase. We now have a sheet of paper. Where should you place the folds so that they satisfy those conditions that I told you, that at every vertex the angles must sum up to pi.
The mathematics took you there.
The mathematics gave us those designs. That was not done by playing, and I want to emphasize.
Okay.
We knew what to do. We basically did the mathematics, and then we wrote a program. Levi Dute, the student who worked with me, essentially did that, wrote a program, and then out came the results. And those results made that prediction, and then you print that out on a 3D printer. You print the piece of paper with the folds. How do you print the folds? You don't print the folds. You essentially laser cut the large piece of paper, not completely but partially, and then Levi sat down and essentially built this. So that was designed rather than empirically met. Yeah, and that's the advantage. So you take the mathematics. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
What shapes are possible to produce?
Oh, very good. Yeah. So the reason I showed you these is precisely because they are all the possible simple combinations. So this object is curved only in one direction and not in the other. This object is curved but the same direction everywhere. This object is curved but in opposite directions along perpendicular directions. So mathematically this has what's called zero Gauss curvature, positive curvature, negative curvature, and then these are mixtures. So over here the center is like this, the top and bottom are like that. Over here the center is the same, the top and bottom are like that. And over here the top is like this and the bottom is like that or that. Okay? So I've basically given you now all the combinations. So now you become a tailor. Okay? You take these objects and you stitch them together, and in principle you should be able to do a lot.
But for example, a Möbius strip, would that be possible?
A Möbius strip I can do with a flat sheet of paper. I don't need to do anything else. Just take a flat sheet of paper, turn it around, and then glue it. I don't need origami.
So is there anything missing among all possible shapes?
I'm not sure what you mean by if there's anything missing. We have the elements. Now, putting them together, my suspicion is, no, there's nothing missing. We can do everything.
So you can create any shape.
Yeah, basically. That's why I showed you these, because these are the basic building blocks, and then you put them together, you should be able to create any shape. And that's if there is, so I don't have a theorem, but I do have an intuition based on all the calculations that we have so far that you can do almost, I think, anything. There are two questions at the back, maybe from the young person. Yeah?
Do you have any good books or resources to recommend for people who want to learn more about the connection between origami and mathematics?
Oh, yes. So I didn't mention, Akira Yoshizawa was this giant who basically took origami, who had sustained origami and then helped a lot of the people today who work on the subject. Recent incarnation, if you will, of that spirit is in Robert Lang. Robert Lang is a physicist from somewhere in California, and he basically started out, as I said, in physics, and then he became an origami scientist, an origami artist, an origami mathematician. And so he's written some very beautiful books. So if you look up Robert Lang and origami, you'll find him. And locally, there is a mathematician and computer scientist at MIT called Eric Demain, some of whose sculptures I actually showed you. And if you go to his website, you will find a lot of resources which essentially link. So both these people, you'll see the link between origami and mathematics. The link between origami and physics and biology, I mean, there are papers. We've written a few papers, but there isn't anything right now which is out there which essentially synthesizes them.
When you're talking about the shapes, there must be some goodness of fit kind of
exactly. Yeah.
Approximation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Make. Yeah.
So you overshoot in some places the curvature of the shape that you're aiming for, in some places you'll undershoot it, but on average you'll get there or something. Is that how?
That's exactly what we showed over here. I didn't have a chance to go through this. Okay. Yeah. So it's exactly that question. So how
asymptotically kind of approaching zero, but then you need to have infinitely bendable.
No, not infinitely bendable. Infinite number of facets.
Okay. Infinite
yeah.
Number of
yeah.
facets.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So we can quantify that. Yeah. So we've done that mathematically. I didn't have a chance to get into the details. That's exactly what this is. So you tell me how well you want to approximate, and then you also tell me how much effort you're willing to put in. You're willing to put in effort, you can approximate well. You're not willing to put in effort, you can't. Yeah. So it's the usual trade-off. Accuracy and effort essentially are what we have to balance off. And so the answer is yes, we can do that mathematically, and then we can also tell, yeah.
And if you could go back a few slides to the one where you showed the angles theorem.
Yeah.
And the next one, I had some questions on those, if you don't mind. Yeah. Okay. So now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that in some of these, you're making the assumption again of zero thickness, right? Somehow.
You're making the assumption not of zero thickness, you're making the assumption the paper can't be stretched or sheared. Okay, so this is the mathematical statement which embodies the physical limit of the sheet of paper being impossibly hard to stretch and impossibly hard to shear. And that leads to these two conditions. As soon as you move away from that for a real sheet of paper, you will essentially have some deviations here and you'll have some deviations over there.
And then if you see in some of the, the Muraori, you have this kind of discontinuity, right? Because it changes direction
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
It's infinite or whatever, the change in the direction of the, as you go along the fold. But when you did the simulations, there were actually curves that came.
They were also discontinued. Yeah.
Okay. And those appear actually, you have these discontinuities.
Yeah, we build them in.
Some kind of smoothing.
No, we build them in. Yeah. We build them in because we say that we created out of facets, and the condition at the locations where the facets meet at every vertex, we must satisfy these conditions. But so the number of facets is something that we prescribe, and then the angle is something that we essentially calculate. And the number is prescribed based on the fact that how well you want to approximate it. So you tell me how many facets you're willing to give me, and I will tell you how well you can use those number of facets to essentially approximate whatever surface you're interested in.
So it's coming out of some kind of difference equation or whatever, not a differential equation or something. So
it is actually, well, we can talk about that technically. Yes, it's a combination. Yeah, you have to solve an optimization problem. Yeah.
For your examples where you get folding effects in nature,
Mm-hmm.
like in the leaf folding or in the gut, is something universally being optimized by nature during evolution of those structures?
No. It's not optimization from the point of view of evolution, but nature is subject, biology is subject to the same laws of physics as simple materials. And so what you're seeing over there is just the consequence of the fact that one part of the material, in that case the inner part of the gut, is growing relative to another part of the material, the outside of the gut. In the case of the wing, I don't know enough about the morphogenesis of how that happens, but it's almost certainly the case that when the wing is forming during development in the insect, it's very likely that that part of the wing is growing relative to a substrate and then was put into compression. The same thing in the leaf. So subject to the same laws, and differential growth plus constraints give you those patterns again and again. But there is nothing which is being, I want to emphasize, there is nothing which is being optimized.
But somehow those structures were selected in those cases, and so apparently there was some advantage.
Yes, but different functions in each case. So in the case of the gut, you want to try and maximize area to basically maximize your ability to absorb nutrients. In the context of the wing, you want to pack away the wing when you basically are foraging through a forest, but you want to deploy it when you want to fly. So it's very different conditions. The packing constraint is generic. So you want to have a lot of surface, but you don't want to give it a lot of volume. So that aspect is very generic. In fact, all these folding patterns that you see, not just in these origami situations, but you look at proteins, you look at your surface of your brain, you look at, as I said before, we talked about it, you look at your gut. All these have a fundamental question associated with trying to maximize, in some sense or the other, surface, but trying not to have a lot of volume. So that aspect sort of comes in again and again. But the functional consequence of having large areas relative to volumes is very different for the brain, because it's associated with information processing, relative to the gut, where it's associated with absorption of nutrients, relative to the lung, where it's associated with essentially maximizing gas exchange, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Another time.